Welcome to this explainer. We're skipping the long intro today because I need to drop you right into one of the most terrifying visceral medical anomalies in human history. We're talking about an event so utterly bizarre, so deeply disturbing that for centuries people literally thought it had to be an urban myth. But it wasn't. It was terrifyingly real. Just imagine walking down a narrow, cobbled medieval street. The air is thick, it's hot, and suddenly you hear the wet slapping of bare feet. You look over and you see people violently thrashing around. They are drenched in sweat, their arms are jerking, their eyes are just completely vacant. They are entirely trapped in their own bodies, crying out for help, completely unable to stop moving until their hearts literally explode in their chests. So what would you do? What would you do if you saw your neighbors, like dozens of them, just seized by some invisible force? What happened next completely shocked the entire town. And honestly, the scariest part of this whole thing, the doctors and authorities had absolutely no idea what was happening. They were paralyzed by a nightmare that completely defied the laws of nature. Part 1. Patient 0. Okay, let's dive into exactly how this started. The nightmare officially kicked off in Strasbourg, France, when a woman known to history as Frau Trophäa stepped out of her home into the humid summer air. Now keep in mind, there was no festival going on, no musicians playing in the street. With zero music whatsoever, she simply began to dance. But this wasn't some joyful jig, okay? It was this fervent, uncontrollable thrashing, and she kept it up for an entire week, day and night, only stopping when she physically passed out from sheer exhaustion. And the craziest part is how fast this spread. It was terrifying. Within just a week, her own husband and 30 locals joined the frenzy. By August, the whole thing exploded. Nearly 400 people, who became known as choreomaniacs, were infected. 400 people. They were moving so violently, so obsessively, that it quickly became clear only death could actually make them stop. Part 2. The deadliest cure. But this is where things get really terrifying. The local authorities stepped in and, well, they made it infinitely worse. The physicians actually rejected the idea of ghosts or demons. Instead, they diagnosed the victims with hot blood. It's this super bizarre 16th century medical theory claiming that an overheated brain and literal boiling blood were causing this uncontrollable spasmodic behavior. So, if the blood is too hot, how do you fix it? Right? You burn it off. So their official medical prescription was, wait for it, more dancing. I'm not kidding. The city council literally built giant public stages right in the town square. They hired professional musicians to play around the clock and even brought in strongmen to hold victims upright when they collapsed. They were literally forcing the afflicted to, quote, dance themselves free of it. Naturally, this backfired absolutely catastrophically. Just put yourself in the shoes of a terrified, superstitious peasant back then. You see this giant government stage filled with hundreds of screaming, thrashing people. The locals firmly believed this was a deadly curse from St. Vitus, punishing sinners. So seeing this massive spectacle, even more terrified people threw themselves into the frenzy. They were desperately dancing to cleanse their sins before the saint could strike them down too. The thing is, the human body is simply not built to survive that kind of exertion. At the absolute peak of this horrific outbreak, up to 15 people were dropping dead every single day. And remember, they weren't dying from a virus. They were dying from massive heart attacks, severe dehydration, and just total, absolute physical exhaustion. Getting absolutely desperate, the council finally banned public music entirely and ordered this deeply creepy, highly specific ritual. They actually forced the surviving dancers to wear red shoes sprinkled with holy water. They handed them incense, painted crosses on their tops and soles, and literally marched them up to a mountaintop shrine while muttering Latin incantations. And then, finally, by September, the plague just stopped. The screaming ended. The streets felt quiet, but the mystery definitely didn't. Like, how does an entire town just catch a dancing disease? Well, modern neurologists and historians have essentially performed a cold case autopsy on this 500-year-old event. And to understand the true horror of what went down, we really have to look at what science says today. Part 3. Poison or psychosis. So modern science basically boils this nightmare down to two massive mind-bending theories. On one side, we're looking at an accidental mass chemical poisoning, and on the other, a complete collective psychological break. Let's look at Theory 1, Ergot poisoning. So ergot is this toxic, psychoactive fungus that grows on damp rye, which was the absolute staple crop for medieval bread. Here's the wild part. The chemical makeup of ergot is actually structurally related to LSD. So the question is, did the entire town accidentally eat hallucinogenic bread and go on a massive deadly trip? I mean, it is the exact same fungus linked to the infamous Salem witch trials. But when you put it under modern medical scrutiny, the ergot theory kind of falls apart. Experts point out that ergot poisoning actually cuts off the blood supply to your limbs, so victims wouldn't be dancing around. They'd literally be writhing in agony on the floor. Plus, the idea that 400 people would all somehow have the exact same coordinated psychotropic trip, yeah, that's practically impossible. So that pretty much rules out the bread, which leaves us with the most widely accepted and, frankly, the absolute most disturbing theory of them all: mass psychogenic illness. To really grasp this, you have to understand the context. The 1500s in the Alsace region was basically a living hell. We're talking back-to-back famines, lethal diseases everywhere, brutally freezing winters. The ongoing psychological trauma was just so suffocating, it pushed the victims into a highly contagious dissociative trance. Think about that for a second. There was no virus, no poison. The human mind in Strasbourg was simply so completely overwhelmed by starvation and fear that it literally snapped. It threw hundreds of innocent people into a collective, completely involuntary psychological break. Their brains just defaulted to their deepest, darkest cultural fear, the dancing curse of St. Vitus. Part 4. The disturbing truth. And doctors at the time? They had absolutely no idea what was happening. They tried to fix it with stages and music, basically pouring gasoline on a psychological fire. But looking at it today through the lens of modern neurology, we know it wasn't a demonic curse. It was a fully developed epidemic pattern of a psychogenic movement disorder. It is the ultimate horrifying proof that overwhelming trauma can literally hijack the human body, basically puppeteering your nervous system into a fatal frenzy. What you really need to take away from this explainer is the terrifying fragility of the human mind. The dancing plague wasn't just some weird, isolated medieval glitch. It's a stark, chilling reminder of how, under enough unrelenting pressure, our own brains can turn against us. They can lock us inside our own bodies and trap us in a literal waking nightmare. So I want to leave you with this one chilling thought. If collective trauma and overwhelming anxiety were the actual contagions back in 1518, what happens to us when our modern world gets just a little too stressful to bear? Could our minds suddenly snap? Could a mass psychogenic plague actually happen again today? Think about that. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and stay curious.